Fog drifted low over the cobblestones, curling like pale fingers around carriage wheels and the hem of every hurried skirt, as though the city itself sought to delay those who traveled toward the Farnham estate that night. Bath had always been a place of contradictions, gleaming windows and gutter whispers, polished manners and secret cruelties, and Lady Eleanor Ashbourne felt all of them pressing upon her as she paused before the tall mirror in her dimly lit chamber. The candles, guttering softly in the draught, offered no kindness to the reflections staring back at her. The fading gray gown, its once delicate lace now fraying at the sleeves, clung without grace. A dress meant for chores, not company. Certainly not for a guest her husband deemed important enough to arrange an entire evening around. She touched the fabric, her fingers tracing the worn seams with a quiet, resigned care. "It will do," she murmured, though the words tasted of defeat. Her maid hesitated, clearly wishing to suggest something finer, but the girl knew better. Lord Ashbourne had been explicit. Eleanor was to remain modest. Subdued was the word he used, so that attention would not drift inappropriately toward her. She was to be as unremarkable as the furniture, a shadow among greater men. And the easiest way to dim a woman was to dress her like a ghost of herself. When Eleanor descended the stairs, the sounds of conversation reached her before she reached the hall. Chiming laughter, the crisp clatter of glasses, the rustle of silks far lovelier than her own. The scent of lavender polish and roasted pheasant mingled heavily in the air. Guests paused as she entered, their glances quick and assessing. She felt them tallying her flaws with the efficiency of seasoned accountants, each flicker of the eye another silent subtraction of her worth. A pair of younger women, bright in jewel-toned gowns, exchanged smiles behind their fans. The men did not bother to hide their disinterest. Her husband approached with brisk steps and a thin smile that failed to reach his eyes. "Eleanor," he said, as though her name were a mild inconvenience. "Do try to look less anxious. Our guest arrives shortly, and it will not do for you to greet him with that expression." "What expression?" she asked, keeping her voice carefully even. "That one," he replied, gesturing vaguely toward her face as if it, too, were an offense. Then, without waiting for her response, he turned to address another gentleman, dismissing her with the simplest, sharpest weapon Victorian society afforded: indifference. Eleanor moved toward the ballroom's edge, pretending to study a vase of winter lilies. She inhaled deeply, hoping their cold fragrance might fortify her. It was foolish to care what these people thought. Yet humiliation prickled at her skin, relentless as sleet. She had not always been the woman in a fading gray gown. Once she had been admired, courted even, before her marriage had turned admiration to obligation and affection to silence. A hush rippled suddenly through the room. The massive doors at the far end opened, and the footman's voice rang out, steady and solemn. "His Grace, the Duke of Blackwell." Her breath stopped. The world tilted. Into the golden wash of candlelight stepped the man she had not seen in nearly 5 years. Adrian Blackwell, taller than memory, broad-shouldered, a figure carved in elegant lines and quiet authority. His black coat was cut to perfection, his hair slightly mussed as though he had ridden hard to arrive on time. The murmurs around him were admiration wrapped in curiosity. The Duke rarely attended such gatherings, yet tonight he entered with a gravity that captured every gaze. Except Eleanor's, which fled to the floor in a frantic attempt at composure. It could not be him. It should not be him. Fate would not be so cruel as to place the one man who had once held her heart, and then crushed it without explanation, into her husband's home, into her line of sight, into the very room where she stood clothed in shame. But fate, she realized bitterly, was rarely kind to women like her. Adrian exchanged civil greetings with the nearest guests, his voice low and warm. Eleanor recognized the cadence instantly. Memory had preserved it with painful clarity. She forced herself to breathe, to remain still, though her pulse beat like a frightened bird beneath her ribs. Then his eyes lifted, and found her. The moment stretched, fine and fragile as blown glass. Adrian staggered, not physically, but in the nearly imperceptible widening of his gaze, in the way his breath seemed to catch against an invisible barrier. She knew that look. She had once lived for that look. Recognition, shock, longing, regret, emotions flickered through him with startling intensity before he mastered them beneath the polished veneer expected of a duke. Eleanor felt every unspoken sentiment like a blow. Her husband, oblivious or pretending to be so, strode forward to greet Adrian with hearty enthusiasm. "Your Grace, what an honor. I trust the ride was not too taxing." His tone carried an undercurrent of self-satisfaction, as though he believed the Duke's presence reflected his own importance. Adrian answered politely enough, yet his attention kept drifting, pulling, toward Eleanor. It was not the gaze of a man encountering an old acquaintance. It was the gaze of a man confronting a ghost he had never laid to rest. "May I present my wife?" Lord Ashbourne said, beckoning her forward with a careless sweep of his hand. "Lady Eleanor." The title hung in the air, brittle as frost. Eleanor stepped forward, willing her spine to remain straight despite the suffocating weight of humiliation. She felt every threadbare inch of her gown, every whisper bouncing off the gilded walls, every memory clawing its way up from the past. Adrian bowed. Not a polite inclination, not a dutiful nod, but a deep, deliberate bow that made several guests gasp softly. When he rose, his eyes held hers with a steadiness that stole her breath. "Lady Eleanor," he said quietly, reverently, as though her name had been locked in his chest for years. "It has been far too long." Her husband stiffened at the intimacy of the tone, though he said nothing. Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but words failed her entirely. All she managed was a fragile nod. A server slipped between them with an apologetic murmur, offering wine. Adrian accepted a glass without looking away from her. She sensed a storm behind his composure, 1,000 questions he could not ask in public, 1,000 apologies she was not ready to hear. The room resumed its low chatter, but an undercurrent of speculation now swept through it. Guests leaned subtly toward one another, hungry for gossip. And beneath that rising tide of whispers, Eleanor felt something shift, an aching premonition that the evening, already precarious, was about to unravel in ways none of them could foresee. For when Adrian finally spoke again, his voice carried a quiet tremor of truth that pierced straight through her defenses. "I had hoped," he murmured, just loud enough for her to hear, "never to see you wounded again." The moment dinner was announced, the atmosphere shifted like a silk curtain caught in a sudden draft. Eleanor felt the weight of the evening settle more heavily upon her shoulders as the guests began filing toward the long mahogany table, its surface glittering with crystal and candlelight. She moved with quiet grace, though her heart beat in uneven strokes, each one echoing the Duke's lingering gaze from moments before. No one else seemed to notice the tremor beneath her composure, but she felt it acutely, as though her very pulse betrayed her. Adrian took his seat across from her, positioned perfectly to see every nuance of her expression. His eyes followed her with a persistence that drew murmurs from the women nearby, veiled whispers behind jeweled fans. Her husband remained oblivious, indulging in boastful anecdotes, too absorbed in his own self-importance to register the growing attention brewing around his table. Eleanor kept her gaze lowered, focusing on the slow swirl of steam rising from her soup rather than the man who had once rewritten the map of her heart. The first course passed in strained silence. Each clink of silverware seemed louder, each muted conversation sharper. Eleanor felt the Duke's gaze like a warm pulse across her skin, a silent plea she refused to acknowledge. She sensed that everyone else felt it too, for the air around them thickened with speculation. A pair of young ladies exchanged knowing looks, their expressions bright with scandalous delight. The presence of a duke always drew interest, but a duke looking too intently at another man's wife? That was a feast. When the second course arrived, a footman approached with unusual hesitation, bowing stiffly as he placed a discreet envelope beneath the edge of Eleanor's plate. The motion was subtle, almost secretive, yet the tremor in the servant's hand suggested he understood the risk of being noticed. Eleanor froze. Her breath shortened. She glanced upward, catching Adrian's gaze. He gave the faintest incline of his head, an unspoken confession that the message was his. With trembling fingers, she slipped the envelope into her lap, concealed beneath the drape of the gray gown. Her heart beat dangerously fast. Her husband was still speaking loudly, something about horses, or taxes, or the misfortunes of lesser men, and the guests near him feigned interest. No one's eyes were on her. Slowly, she opened the seal. Inside lay a single winter rose, pressed flat but still retaining the ghost of its delicate perfume. Beneath it, 4 words written in Adrian's unmistakable hand, Forgive me, just once. Her throat tightened painfully. The rose felt like a memory resurrected, fragile and dangerous. She closed her fist around the note, hiding it before anyone could see, yet the gesture brought no relief. She could feel the Duke watching her reaction, reading every flicker of emotion she tried to suppress. She wanted to fling the token aside. She wanted to hold it to her heart. She wanted 1,000 things she could no longer allow herself to want. But desire, in a room full of predators, always left a scent. The first whisper reached her before the next dish. "Did you see how he looked at her?" murmured a woman draped in burgundy silk. "A duke does not bow like that without reason." "Perhaps there was an attachment," another replied, "before she married beneath her station." "Or perhaps," the burgundy woman added with a wicked smile, "there still is." Eleanor stiffened, her face warming under the soft scrutiny of speculative eyes. She tried to appear unaffected, but the murmurs crawled beneath her skin like cold ink spreading across parchment. Her husband, wrapped in self-satisfaction, noticed nothing. Dinner ended at last, and guests drifted toward the grand balcony where the moon hung low over the garden like a silver sentinel. Eleanor stepped into the night air, desperate for a moment of solitude. The chill kissed her cheeks, soothing the heat of humiliation. She stood with hands resting on the stone balustrade, breathing deeply, imagining she could release the tightness in her chest with each exhale. Footsteps approached behind her. She knew who it was before he spoke. "Eleanor," Adrian said softly, his voice carrying the weight of words he longed to say but could not risk. She refused to turn. The moonlight stretched her shadow across the floor, merging with his. "You should not speak to me," she said, her tone a brittle whisper. "And yet you read my note." "That was an intrusion, Your Grace." Her sarcasm was a thin shield, one he saw through effortlessly. He stood beside her, leaving a careful distance between them. The scent of rain clung to him, fresh and familiar. "Your husband treats you with far less regard than even the air surrounding this balcony," he murmured. "You forfeited the right to concern yourself with my well-being years ago." He flinched, but only slightly. "If I forfeited it, it was not willingly." Eleanor gripped the balustrade harder. "Your explanations are unnecessary." She looked away, though tears pricked unbidden. "And unwelcome." Adrian exhaled slowly. "Then tell me only this. Does seeing me wound you, or does the sight of me merely reopen what time never managed to close?" She nearly broke at the gentleness in his voice. It was infuriating. It was devastating. She forced her breath steady, refusing to let him see her tremble. Before she could answer, footsteps thundered onto the balcony. Her husband appeared, jaw rigid, eyes narrowing at the sight before him. "Eleanor," he said sharply, "I trust you are not imposing upon His Grace's generosity with your presence." Adrian stepped forward, his expression composed but cold. "Lady Eleanor imposes upon no one, my lord." Lord Ashbourne bristled. It would serve her well to remember her place. Eleanor felt humiliation rise again, thick and suffocating, but this time something else stirred beneath it, anger, quiet and sharp. The three stood in tense silence, the moon casting long shadows across the stone. A storm of consequences gathered in the air, unseen but palpable. And when Adrian's gaze flicked toward her husband with unmistakable warning, Eleanor understood that the night's fragile balance had shifted, and the scandal she feared was no longer a distant threat, but an inevitable reckoning waiting to break. The storm began its assault shortly after midnight, rattling the window panes with a force that shook dust from the chandelier. Most guests had already retired, coerced by the rain into accepting Lord Ashbourne's reluctant hospitality for the night. Eleanor lingered in the dim corridor outside her room, the soft glow of a single wall sconce casting a weak pool of light across the carpet. She had hoped for silence, just a moment to breathe after the torment of dinner, but her thoughts were as restless as the wind. She walked slowly, fingertips brushing the carved wainscoting as though its solidity might steady her. Every breath she drew felt tight, pinned between shame and anger. Adrian's presence had reduced her carefully built composure to rubble. His eyes had sparked memories she spent years burying. His rose burned like a coal beneath her pillow. His voice, heaven help her, his voice still stirred every fragile corner of her heart. She reached the end of the hallway, turned, and nearly collided with Adrian himself. He stood with his hair damp, curls darkened by the storm. Water glistened on the shoulders of his coat, and his breath came as though he had hurried, seeking her. Eleanor stepped back instinctively, her heartbeat ricocheting through her chest. "Forgive me," he said softly. "I had not meant to startle you." "You should be in your chambers," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "It is improper to be wandering the corridors at this hour." "I could not sleep," he answered. "Not while you suffer under the weight of things that were never your burden to carry." Her resolve wavered, but she forced her chin up. "I am not suffering." "You are," he said gently. "You have been suffering for years." She hated that he could see it. Hated that he still understood her with such accuracy. "Whatever you believe you know of my life," she whispered, "you forfeited the right to speak of it the day you vanished. Not a letter, not a word." His jaw tightened. A shadow crossed his face, deepening the lines of pain and regret that had not existed in the man she once loved. "Eleanor," he murmured, "I never meant to vanish. Yet you did. And I regretted it every day." Her breath snagged. She turned away, staring at the flickering sconce as though the light might melt the icy knot of anger inside her. "Regret," she repeated bitterly. "A very fine sentiment. Rather late." Adrian moved closer, not touching her, but close enough that she felt the warmth radiating from him. "You deserve the truth," he said. "All of it." "I deserve peace," she countered. He shook his head. "Peace cannot be built on falsehoods." Eleanor wanted to walk away. She tried to will her feet to move, but something pinned her, some mixture of old longing and unresolved pain. "Say what you must," she whispered. Adrian drew a slow, steadying breath. "I never abandoned you." The simple confession struck like a crack of thunder. "I was taken." She spun to face him. "Taken? By whom?" "By the Crown's agents," he said. "Under suspicion of treason." Eleanor stared at him as though he were speaking a foreign language. "That is impossible." "You, treason?" "You were one of their favored sons." "That is precisely why they feared I knew too much." His voice dropped, raw and honest. "Someone forged letters in my hand. Letters that suggested I was leaking political documents to foreign agents. On the night I planned to propose to you, they seized me." She felt the blood drain from her face. "You proposed?" "You, Adrian. I never received any such intention." He looked at her with such anguish that it fractured her breath. "Because the letter I sent you, the one asking you to meet me that night, was intercepted, replaced with another." He swallowed hard. "Did you not receive something cruel? Something cold?" Eleanor's heart twisted violently. She remembered all too vividly. The letter she received had been icy, dismissive, ending things without explanation. She had cried for days before forcing herself to bury every dream she'd built with him. "I thought you hated me." "I loved you," he said, the words breaking. "I loved you so fiercely it terrified me. And when they dragged me away that night, I shouted your name like a madman." He raised a trembling hand to his brow. "But my voice never reached you." Eleanor's knees weakened. She leaned against the wall, consumed by a grief both old and new. "Why did you never write again?" she whispered. "I did," he said. "Dozens of letters. Years of them. All were intercepted." His gaze darkened. "Your husband had connections in the Home Office. His family made certain I stayed silent." She stared at him, horrified. "My husband? Why?" "Because he wanted you," Adrian said simply. "And he wanted what marrying you would gain him. Lands. Reputation. Access to your family's estates." He paused. "He ensured I disappeared long enough for you to believe I had abandoned you, long enough for him to persuade your parents that I was untrustworthy." Eleanor pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting against the rising tide of emotion. Rage, despair, betrayal. It was too much. "All these years," she choked. I believed I was unworthy, that you had grown tired of me. You were the only part of my life that kept me alive in that cell, he said fiercely. The thought of you, your laughter, your letters, your dreams. You were my single tether to sanity. And when I was cleared, when the truth finally emerged, I searched for you, only to find you wed. Her tears spilled, silent and devastating. Adrian reached out, then stopped himself, hand suspended in the air. Eleanor, he whispered, voice trembling, I never betrayed you. She looked at him through blurred vision. But I betrayed myself, she said, breaking, by believing you could. In that moment, footsteps echoed at the far end of the corridor. Heavy, purposeful, too familiar. Her husband was no longer asleep. The courtyard was still slick from the night's rain, the stones glistening like a polished blade as dawn crept over the estate. A hush clung to the air, thick with dread. Eleanor stood near the balustrade, gloved hands clasped so tightly the stitching bit into her palms. She had not slept. How could she, when the man she once believed incapable of cruelty had stormed into the corridor the previous night and accused her of treachery, rage burning in his eyes like a possessed torch? And now Adrian, worn from years of injustice, fueled by a truth no one had allowed him to speak, had answered her husband's fury with a solemn promise. He would no longer hide. She turned as Adrian stepped into the courtyard. The early light framed him, sharpening the strong line of his jaw and the resolve in his eyes. He bowed his head slightly, not out of deference, but in acknowledgment of the danger ahead. You should not be here, he murmured. I have as much right as any spectator, she replied, though her voice faltered. More, perhaps. You risk being seen. I no longer care who sees. The admission surprised even her. Something inside her had cracked open the night before, something that refused to be sealed again. He studied her, and in the brief silence she heard everything he did not speak. Regret, gratitude, longing. But before he could answer, Lord Hawthorne entered the courtyard, boots striking the stones with a confidence bordering on arrogance. His coat was immaculate, the deep maroon fabric brushing sharply against the wind. Eleanor felt the old, familiar dread coil in her stomach. Hiding behind your former lover, he said, his voice dripping contempt. Fitting. Adrian stepped between them. You will not speak to her that way. Lord Hawthorne's lips curled. You speak as though you have earned the right to defend her. You have not. His gaze flicked toward Eleanor. Her loyalty resides with her husband. Eleanor stiffened. My loyalty resides with truth. Her husband's expression darkened, but he turned away as the appointed seconds called for the duel to begin. Swords gleamed in the morning light, their edges sharp enough to sever more than flesh. Adrian removed his coat, revealing the lean strength forged in captivity. Lord Hawthorne rolled his shoulders, every movement a declaration of entitlement. The seconds stepped back. A bird cawed somewhere in the distance. Then steel clashed. The first strike rang through the courtyard like a bell tolling the start of a reckoning. Adrian moved with surprising precision, each step measured, each parry deliberate. Years in confinement had not weakened him, they had honed him. Lord Hawthorne, accustomed to winning by intimidation rather than merit, fought with raw force, slamming against Adrian's defenses like a storm battering a cliff. Eleanor pressed a hand to her mouth as sparks flew from their blades. Every sound carved through her, every grunt, every scrape of metal. She remembered the warmth of Adrian's hand when he once held hers, the danger in her husband's eyes the night they wed, the heavy silence that had swallowed the truth for far too long. Now the truth bled into the open, as sharp and undeniable as their swords. You dare return after disgracing her? Lord Hawthorne snarled, driving forward. You disgraced her, Adrian retorted, catching the attack and twisting sharply. You stole her choices. You mutilated her future. The words struck like blows, each one cracking the veneer of superiority Lord Hawthorne wore like armor. He attacked wildly, forcing Adrian backward until his boots skidded near the courtyard's edge. Eleanor gasped. Adrian steadied himself. You fear exposure more than defeat. Lord Hawthorne lunged. Adrian pivoted, letting the force of the attack carry the man past him. Their blades locked again, sparks flying between their furious gazes. "Enough," Eleanor cried, though neither man heeded her. Lord Hawthorne shoved Adrian back and raised his sword for a killing stroke. Eleanor's heart lurched. Adrian staggered, his breath ragged, but he lifted his blade again with unwavering resolve. "You took years from me," he said, voice low. "But you will not take her." Something in that declaration struck Eleanor with more force than the clash of steel. She felt heat bloom behind her eyes, a swell of emotion she could no longer restrain. The truth was no longer a fragile, hidden flame. It was a wildfire. Lord Hawthorne roared and charged. Adrian met him. Their swords collided with a sound like the sky splitting open. Adrian pushed forward, step by controlled step, driving Lord Hawthorne backward until the man's feet slipped slightly on the damp stones. In that heartbeat of imbalance, Adrian twisted sharply and disarmed him, Lord Hawthorne's sword clattering across the courtyard like a cry of surrender. Eleanor gasped again. This time with breath she had forgotten how to hold. Adrian stepped back, chest heaving, blade lowered but not relaxed. Lord Hawthorne froze, shock overtaking rage. Never had he imagined defeat. Certainly not at the hands of the man he betrayed. "You will leave this estate today," Adrian said quietly, "and you will never raise a hand, or a threat, against her again." Lord Hawthorne's expression contorted. "You presume to." "I presume nothing," Adrian cut in. "I am merely rectifying the injustice you built your life upon." Eleanor waited for her husband to shout, to strike, to reclaim control with violence. But instead he stared at her, long, searching, furious in a way she had never seen. "You choose him," he said. Her breath trembled, but her voice did not. "I choose freedom." Something broke in his gaze. Then, without another word, he turned and strode from the courtyard, boots echoing his retreat. Silence enveloped the air. Eleanor closed her eyes as relief, grief, and dizzying uncertainty collided inside her. When she opened them, Adrian was watching her with an expression both tender and tired. "It is over," he whispered. She stepped toward him. "No," she said softly. "It is beginning." But before he could answer, a servant rushed into the courtyard, face pale, breathless with urgency. He leaned close to Eleanor, whispering something that drained the color from her cheeks. Adrian caught her arm. "What is it?" She swallowed hard. "There has been another accusation." Her voice shook. "Against you." And the dawn suddenly felt colder. Dawn broke over the Farnham estate in a delicate haze, soft light spilling across the wet garden like liquid gold. Eleanor stepped onto the balcony, bare hands resting on the cold stone balustrade. The winter rose Adrian had once pressed into her hand lay in a small glass vase before her, its petals perfectly preserved, fragile as a memory. She inhaled deeply, the scent carrying a haunting mixture of nostalgia, longing, and hope. For the first time in years, she felt the storm inside her begin to settle. Adrian approached, his coat damp from the morning mist, hair curling slightly over his forehead. His gaze, unwavering and deep, held no arrogance, only the quiet certainty of a man who had endured injustice and emerged determined to claim what was right. Eleanor's heart quickened. Every moment since the night of revelation had brought them closer, though walls of propriety and social expectation still lingered between them like shadowed hedges. "You are here," she said softly, a whisper against the sighing wind. "You keep appearing when I least expect it." "I go where I am needed," he replied, stepping nearer. The air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken words. "And I am needed here." She turned to face him fully, the pale sunlight catching in her eyes. She could see the fatigue of his past years etched across his face, yet beneath it, a fire still burned, a fire meant for her, and only her. Eleanor felt a swell of emotion she had fought to suppress, anger at what was stolen, grief for what was lost, and above all, a deep, unrelenting love. "You come to me now, after everything," she said. "Do you believe apologies will heal what has been broken?" Her voice trembled, betraying the strength she tried to project. Adrian's hand hovered over hers, almost touching, but he did not yet bridge the distance. I do not offer apologies as a salve. I offer the truth. And if you will allow me, a chance to make right what was done. His voice was a low timbre, resonant, carrying both reverence and a quiet insistence. Eleanor looked down at the winter rose, fragile and eternal, and then back at him. The flower had been a token of his promise, an emblem of the love they had been denied by treachery and circumstance. She realized that in its presence, fear and doubt seemed smaller, more manageable. Perhaps it was time to let herself believe that love could endure, even in the face of society's cruel strictures. Adrian's hand brushed hers at last, tentative, light as a sigh. Eleanor shivered, not from the cold, but from the intensity of the connection reigniting between them. If I accept this, she said, what becomes of the world that expects me to remain constrained? The world, he said, voice steady, has never understood you, nor would it ever. But that does not matter. Only your choice matters now. He lifted his hand to the winter rose, the same rose she had returned to him months ago. Let this mark the return of what was never truly lost. Eleanor closed her eyes. Memories rose unbidden. The first time they had danced under chandeliers, the stolen letters of love intercepted, the nights spent waiting for a word that never came. Her chest tightened with the weight of longing and betrayal. And yet, with Adrian standing before her, his presence a promise of protection and devotion, she felt a cautious lightness she had not known in years. She opened her eyes and saw not a man defeated, but a man who had suffered for the sake of truth and love, who had returned for her with undiminished courage. You return to me, she said softly, and I cannot say I do not still love you. The words felt like a confession carved from ice, brittle yet honest, breaking open the space between them. But the world may never forgive me. Adrian's eyes softened, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile curved his lips. Then we shall move forward regardless of the world's judgment. I will protect you from its scrutiny. I will not allow them to dictate the life you deserve. His hand closed over hers fully, strong and reassuring, bridging the final gap between fear and hope. A sudden rustle in the garden drew their attention. The servants moved silently, observing from a respectful distance, but their presence did not disturb the intimacy of the moment. Eleanor allowed herself a deep breath, tasting the clarity of choice and the sweetness of agency. At last, she could step into the life she wished to claim, free from secrets, free from the manipulations of men who had sought to define her. Adrian lowered his face closer to hers, the words forming as if they had been waiting years to be spoken. Eleanor Ashbourne, if you will have me, I will dedicate every day of my life to proving that love can endure, even in the coldest winter, even against the harshest of fates. His voice was tender yet insistent, a promise carved into the very air around them. Her heart swelled. She stepped closer, until their foreheads nearly touched. Then I shall trust you, she said, a quiet vow that felt like both surrender and triumph. Not the world, not its expectations, but you. A gust of wind swept across the balcony, lifting a stray lock of her hair and carrying the faint scent of rain and earth. The winter rose trembled in its vase, a fragile symbol of endurance, and Eleanor reached out to touch it gently. The moment felt eternal, the world itself pausing to honor the reconciliation of hearts long separated by deceit and circumstance. Together, Adrian whispered, taking the rose into his hands and offering it to her, we begin anew. His eyes, steadfast and unwavering, conveyed a gravity of emotion words alone could not bear. Eleanor accepted the token, their fingers brushing, the warmth of their touch solidifying the fragile promise that had persisted through years of injustice. She inhaled the rose's scent once more and allowed herself to believe. The past would remain a shadow, yes, but it would no longer dictate her future. The pain, the betrayal, the endless nights of longing, all were threads woven into a tapestry now rich with color, no longer only dark. Eleanor met Adrian's gaze. Let the world witness, then, what they will, she said, her voice strong despite the tremor of emotion. We choose truth, we choose love, and we choose each other. Her declaration echoed across the courtyard, carried by the soft morning breeze, a defiance of expectation and a celebration of reclaimed freedom. Adrian bent forward and pressed a chaste but reverent kiss to the top of her hand. The gesture weighted with respect, apology, and devotion. And I shall never let you regret it, he vowed, as the first rays of the sun ignited the petals of the winter rose like a flame caught in glass. The world could judge, could whisper, could attempt to contain them, but they had chosen themselves, and that choice was eternal. Together, they stepped back from the balustrade, hands entwined, their steps measured but unhesitating. Every stone beneath their feet seemed to affirm the path they had claimed, each echo a testament to resilience, defiance, and the enduring power of love. Eleanor felt her chest lift with unaccustomed ease, as though the weight of years of misunderstanding had been lifted from her very shoulders. A soft smile curved her lips. The estate beyond the balcony lay quiet, awaiting the stirrings of the day, but within her heart a storm had passed, leaving light in its wake. The winter rose, perched delicately between them, was no longer merely a symbol of a promise kept but of lives reclaimed, of love vindicated against the cruelty of fate. And as the wind whispered through the garden, carrying the faint scent of rain and earth, Eleanor knew one immutable truth. No power, no societal expectation, no shadow of the past could touch what had finally been restored. Adrian's gaze met hers once more, steady, unwavering, and filled with the unspoken vow that had endured all odds. The winter rose remained between them, fragile yet eternal, a testament to a love that had been tested by time and treachery, a love that had returned, whole, unbroken, and triumphant. And in that quiet, shining morning, Eleanor understood that this was only the beginning, the reclaiming of joy, the forging of a future unbound, and the promise that, for the first time in years, her heart belonged solely to herself, and to the man who had never ceased to honor it.